That night, rescuers arrived in a quiet neighborhood and stopped cold. A wild bobcat wasn't attacking. He was gently holding a crying white Munchkin kitten who sounded like she was running out of breath. One wrong move could save her or destroy the only warmth keeping her alive. When the vet team separated them, by protocol, the kitten's breathing crashed within seconds. And what the doctors discovered next left everyone in the room in tears. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The call came in just after midnight, the kind that makes even seasoned rescuers sit up straighter. Dr. Elaine Parker had been halfway through a lukewarm cup of chamomile when her phone buzzed across the kitchen counter, lighting the room in a pale, watery blue. The dispatcher's voice was tight, almost embarrassed. A homeowner on the edge of Maple Ridge Estates, quiet streets, trimmed hedges, porch lights like tiny moons, was reporting something wrong near the back fence. Not a raccoon in the trash, not a stray dog, a bobcat. Elaine had heard hundreds of worried voices over the years. This one sounded different, strained in a way that suggested the caller was trying not to panic. "It's holding a kitten," the man said, "like it's hugging it, and the kitten keeps crying." In the truck, Mason Reed drove with both hands firm on the wheel, wipers ticking steadily over a light mist that smelled of wet cedar and cold asphalt. Taryn Gwynn sat behind him, glancing down at a tablet where she'd already pulled up the address and the nearest access point for animal control. The cabin heater blew warm air that carried the faint scent of antiseptic from their gear. Elaine stared out at the dark, at the way the street lights smeared into amber streaks on the windshield, and tried to picture what the caller had described. A predator hugging a kitten. It sounded like a prank. It also sounded, in a strange and unsettling way, like truth. They turned into Maple Ridge Estates, where the night felt overly tidy. Houses sat back from the road, windows black, lawns silvered with moisture. A porch light flicked on as they parked. A man in a flannel shirt stepped out, shoulders hunched against the damp, his breath visible in short bursts. "It's back there," he whispered, as if the wrong volume might shatter the moment. "I didn't want to scare it off." They followed him through a side gate. The yard opened into a narrow strip of brush beyond the fence line, where blackberry canes and young firs tangled together. The air changed back there, more earth than neighborhood, more wild. Elaine lifted her headlamp, and the beam cut a clean white path through darkness, catching raindrops that hung like tiny glass beads on the leaves. Then Tara froze. Mason's boots stopped mid-step. Near the fence, at the edge of the brush, a bobcat sat as still as a carved figure. Its coat looked washed in smoky browns and grays, dampened to a darker sheen. The animal's ears were upright and alert, black tufts trembling slightly with each breath. But it wasn't watching them the way a cornered wildcat would. Its gaze was fixed downward, intent, almost protective. And in its forelegs, pulled in close like a careful cradle, was a kitten. A white Munchkin, impossibly small, its short legs tucked beneath it. Its fur was matted, tinged faintly pink around the nostrils. The kitten's mouth opened in thin, wavering cries that cut straight through Elaine's chest. Not loud, not dramatic, just a sound of pure need, raw and exhausting, like a candle struggling in wind. The bobcat didn't bite. It didn't pin. It held. One paw rested over the kitten's back. The other braced along its side, creating a pocket of warmth against the bobcat's chest. Every so often, the wildcat dipped its head and nudged the kitten's ear with its nose, a soft, deliberate motion. When the kitten shivered, the bobcat's body tightened around it in response, as if saying, without any language, "Stay with me." Elaine felt the night go very quiet inside her. She could hear the faint hiss of mist in the trees, the distant hum of a highway, the homeowner's breath catching behind them. Up close, She caught another smell, metallic and wrong, the sharp edge of old blood carried on wet fur. Mason whispered, "This can't be real." "It's real," Tara said, voice barely above air. Elaine crouched slowly, keeping her shoulders low, her hands visible. She'd been trained to read animals the way some people read faces. The bobcat's muscles were coiled, yes, but not for attack. Its lips pulled back slightly when her light shifted, revealing teeth in a warning that seemed less like threat and more like plea. "Don't take this from me." Elaine tilted the beam away, letting the light soften. "Easy," she murmured, the word more for herself than anyone. "We're not here to hurt you." The kitten cried again, a thin, trembling sound. Elaine watched its chest. The rise and fall was uneven, little pauses that made her stomach turn. Hypothermia, maybe. Respiratory infection. Shock. The kitten's eyes were half-lidded, cloudy with fatigue, but it leaned into the bobcat's warmth like it knew, somewhere deep and instinctive, that this was the only thing keeping it alive. Tara eased the thermal carrier out of the kit, the plastic warm box already humming quietly, a low mechanical purr. She cracked it open just enough for Elaine to see the heat packs inside, glowing faintly. The scent of clean fabric and warmed air drifted out. Mason slid a padded control pole from the truck case, but held it down by his side, unsure. "If we spook it, it bolts into the brush," he said, "and we lose the kitten." Elaine nodded once, slow. The choice sat in her hands like something fragile. This was a neighborhood edge, not deep wilderness. A bobcat here meant roads, dogs, people with bad ideas. It also meant the animal might already be injured. She inched forward, one knee, sinking into damp grass. The cold seeped through her jeans. She could feel her pulse in her fingertips. The bobcat's head turned slightly. Its eyes caught her headlamp's glow, golden, reflective, startlingly tired. It made a low sound, not a growl exactly, more like a roughened breath pushed through the throat. Elaine spoke softly, using the same tone she'd used with frightened patients in emergency rooms and frightened animals in cages. "I see you," she said. "I see what you're doing." Tara's light swept the ground and caught something that changed the air again. A thin, cruel line across the bobcat's front leg, the fur rubbed away, the skin raised and angry. And just above the paw, a deeper mark, a tight groove that didn't belong to nature. Mason stepped closer, his face tightening. "That's a wire." Elaine's stomach dropped. In her mind, the scene snapped into sharper focus. A bobcat limping through brush, a trap biting into flesh, pain driving it toward the only movement it could hear. A kitten crying somewhere nearby, lost, discarded, or dumped. Its voice carrying like a siren. And instead of turning away, the bobcat had stopped, had gathered the kitten in, had held it. The kitten's cries softened into small hiccups, as if it was running out of strength. Elaine didn't think about politics or paperwork in that moment. She thought about warmth and oxygen, about keeping a heart beating until sunrise. She thought about the kind of compassion that doesn't make sense, but still happens. "Okay," she whispered to Mason and Tara, keeping her eyes on the bobcat. "We do this slow, no sudden moves. We save the kitten first. And we don't make an enemy of the one thing keeping it alive." Behind them, the homeowner let out a shaky breath. "Is it going to hurt it?" Elaine swallowed, tasting cold air and something like fear. "Not if we're careful," she said. "Not if we respect what we're seeing." In the back of her mind, a different worry flickered. No yet, how much this call could cost the center if things went wrong. Grants, liability insurance, the kind of high-dollar support that kept their doors open and paid for emergency surgery when a bear came in with a shattered paw. But that was for later. For now, There was only the bobcat's steady hold and the kitten's fading voice. Elaine shifted the carrier a few inches closer, letting warmth spill into the damp night. The bobcat's nostrils flared. Its paw tightened protectively over the kitten's back, and in that small movement, Elaine felt the story begin. Something that would test every protocol she'd ever signed and every hard rule she'd ever followed. By the time they reached Redwood Ridge Wildlife Medical Unit, the sky had begun to thin from black to a bruised gray, as if dawn were reluctant to show its face. The truck's tires hissed over wet pavement, and the warm carrier on Tara's lap gave off a steady, low hum that sounded almost like a sleeping cat. Inside it, the white Munchkin kitten's cries had faded to tiny, breathy squeaks, each one shorter, weaker, like a radio signal losing power. Mason backed into the bay while Elaine shoved the door open with her shoulder. The building smelled of disinfectant and old coffee, that sharp, clean scent that never quite masks the truth: fear, blood, and long nights. Fluorescent lights snapped on overhead, turning everything a hard, pale color. No softness, no mercy. The bobcat's crate thudded onto the rolling cart with a dull metal clank, and the sound seemed to wake something in the animal. A rough, rasping call rolled from its throat, not loud, but thick with urgency. Elaine felt it in her ribs. Not rage, not hunger. A kind of pleading. They moved fast. Tara slid the kitten's carrier onto a stainless table, and Elaine's fingers, still cold from the yard, found the kitten's tiny chest through the fleece. The heartbeat was there, fluttering, stubborn, but the body was frighteningly light, as if it could disappear in her hands. The kitten's fur smelled faintly of damp leaves and something sweet sour, the scent of sickness you can't confuse with anything else. A door swung open behind them. Dr. Grant Holloway stepped into the room like a judge entering a courtroom. Mid-50s, silver at the temples, eyes that had seen too many exceptions become disasters. He took in the bobcat crate, the kitten, the team's mud-splattered boots, and his jaw tightened. "Tell me this is not what I think it is," he said. Elaine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "We found a bobcat holding the kitten, keeping it warm, protecting it." Grant's gaze flicked to the bobcat. The animal pressed forward against the crate door, ears pricked, eyes fixed on the table where the kitten lay. Another low call vibrated through the metal bars, and the kitten responded with a thin, trembling squeak, as if the sound itself were a rope between them. "Protocol says separation," Grant replied, flat and practiced. "Different species, no contact, no conditioning." Elaine glanced at the monitor Tara had clipped on. The kitten's breathing was uneven, a faint wheeze you could almost hear if you leaned close enough. "Protocol also says stabilize the patient," she said. "Right now, the only thing that's kept this kitten from slipping away is that bobcat's body heat." Grant's mouth pressed into a line. "You want to risk this center's license on a story that sounds like a fairy tale?" The words landed heavy. Elaine thought about their liability insurance, the grants that paid for emergency veterinarian care, the donors who didn't like controversy, the medical bills that stacked up behind every rescued animal. She thought, too, about the calls from frightened homeowners begging for wildlife removal services, and how quickly compassion turned to complaints when wild things crossed a fence line. But when Tara gently slid the kitten's warm carrier a few inches farther from the bobcat crate, the kitten's tiny body tensed. The oxygen reading dipped, the wheeze sharpened, and the bobcat's call turned ragged as if it could feel the distance like pain. Elaine moved the carrier back, closer, just enough. The kitten's breath eased by a fraction, and the numbers steadied like a hand finding a rail in the dark. The room went still. Grant stared at the monitor, then at Elaine, and for the first time, his certainty wavered, not much, but enough to be seen. "This stays quiet," he said at last, voice low. "One mistake, and I shut it down. Do you understand me?" Elaine nodded, even as her throat tightened, because now the question wasn't whether the kitten would live. It was what this bond would cost them before the morning was over. Late morning at Redwood Ridge carried a pewter light that made everything look colder than it was. The center ran on familiar noises, a dryer thumping blankets, monitors beeping, coffee turning bitter on a hot plate. But in Bay 2, another sound kept returning, low and rough, vibrating through metal. The Bobcat called again. It wasn't a snarl or a warning spit. It came in short, husky bursts, almost rhythmic, like a rasped lullaby. Tara stood beside the crate, listening the way you listen for a loved one in a crowded room. Each time the white Munchkin kitten let out a thin squeak inside the warming carrier, the Bobcat answered, and the air seemed to tighten. "He's tracking her," Tara whispered, "not with eyes, with sound." Grant Holloway stayed in the doorway, arms folded, face set. "Record your observations," he said, "but we separate species, no exceptions." Elaine didn't argue. She and Tara wrote down vitals and timing, the kind of notes that mattered for emergency vet care and the center's liability insurance when hard questions came later. When Tara nudged the carrier a few inches away to check the kitten's IV line, the kitten's breathing turned wet and uneven, a faint wheeze that made Elaine's stomach clench. She slid the carrier back near the crate. The numbers steadied. The kitten's tiny chest rose and fell like a candle flame finding shelter. The Bobcat pressed his face to the bars. His whiskers trembled. He made that husky call again, softer this time, and the kitten blinked toward him as if that sound alone had weight. Elaine felt something shift in her ribs. She'd learned to trust data over stories. Yet the story was changing the data. Then heels clicked on the concrete. Marcy Klein stepped in, raincoat the color of cream, phone in hand, perfume faintly floral against the clean sting of disinfectant. Her eyes flicked from the crate to the carrier. "A neighbor posted about wildlife removal services at Maple Ridge," she said to Grant, voice bright but sharp. "If this becomes a spectacle, donors pull back. Funding dries up. Even things like pet insurance, education get cut." Grant's jaw tightened. "We're handling it." Marcy's gaze slid to Elaine. "Handled means protocol." Before Elaine could answer, a soft scrape sounded from the crate. Everyone turned. On Tara's tablet, the security camera feed showed the Bobcat easing a paw through the lowest gap he could reach. No strike, no clawing, just a careful hook on the carrier's edge. He drew it an inch closer, slow as breath, then laid his foreleg along the side as if to hold it there. For a moment, even Marcy went silent. Elaine stared at the screen until her eyes stung. Whatever paperwork waited, whatever headlines might come, one truth sat plain as morning. This animal wasn't trying to take the kitten. He was trying not to lose her. Mason waited until the afternoon lull, when the hallways at Redwood Ridge quieted to a steady murmur. Laundry tumbling, a distant phone ringing, the soft click of Tara's pen as she charted numbers that didn't make sense on paper. The Bobcat had finally settled into a tense, watchful stillness, his golden eyes never leaving the warming carrier. The kitten's breathing was still fragile, but steadier than it had been at dawn. Grant had told them to keep things contained. Marcy had made it clear that anything public could become a problem. Donors, grants, even the center's liability insurance. But Mason couldn't shake the image of that wire groove on the Bobcat's leg. A snare didn't happen by accident, and if there was one, there could be more. He drove back to Maple Ridge Estates under a low sky the color of cold steel. The neighborhood looked normal in daylight. Mailboxes, wreaths left over from last season, the clean lines of fences. But beyond the backyards, the land dipped into a messy stretch of brush that smelled of damp bark and crushed pine needles. The kind of place people pretended wasn't part of their world until something wild stepped out of it. Mason parked near the same side gate and walked the fence line slowly, eyes down. The ground was soft from overnight mist, and his boots sank with a quiet suction sound. He found the first sign almost immediately, a scuffed path through the grass, as if something heavy had been dragged. The flattened blades were darker than the rest, slick and pressed tight to the soil. 20 feet farther, tucked beneath a tangle of blackberry canes, he saw it. A snare. Not a clean piece of equipment used by professionals. This was cheap wire, twisted by hand, the loop still partly open like a mouth that had missed its bite. The metal smelled sharp and rusty when he leaned close, and the sight of it made his jaw clench. Beside it were small spots of dried blood, brown-red against the mud, and a patch of fur snagged on a thorn. Mason took photos with his phone, careful to frame the details the way he had been taught. Wire gauge, anchor point, the way the loop had been set at ankle height. He could already hear the excuses someone might give. Later, kids, coyotes. Just trying to protect my property. The same kind of talk that turned cruelty into something that sounded like common sense. He kept walking. Near the edge of the brush, the drag marks crossed over a shallow ditch. On the other side, the soil held something else. Faint tire tracks, narrow with a repeating tread pattern that didn't match a family sedan. A work vehicle, maybe a small trailer. Mason felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. This wasn't just a backyard problem. A gust lifted the leaves and something pale flashed near a stump. Mason crouched and pulled it free with gloved fingers. A torn strip of plastic, the kind used on shipping tags or sealed containers. The surface was smeared with mud, but a few letters still showed through in faded black ink. Cloud. That was all. The rest had been ripped away. Mason stared at it for a long second, listening to the quiet neighborhood sounds behind him. Someone's sprinkler ticking, a dog barking once and stopping. He thought about the kitten's strange breed, that bright white coat, those short legs, not the kind of cat you usually found shivering under brush. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A message from Tara. The kitten's oxygen dipped when the bobcat couldn't hear her. Elaine wants answers. Mason slipped the plastic into an evidence bag. He wasn't sure yet who he was calling, wildlife enforcement, local police, maybe even an attorney who understood animal cruelty laws. But he knew this much. The story wasn't only about a bobcat and a kitten. Something else had moved through this place in the dark, leaving behind wire, blood, and a name that didn't belong in the woods. By the next morning, Redwood Ridge felt like it was holding its breath. Rain tapped the windows in a steady, impatient rhythm, and the hallway air carried that familiar mix of bleach, damp wool, and burnt coffee. Elaine hadn't slept. She'd sat with the kitten's monitor glow reflecting off her hands, watching numbers rise and fall like a tide you couldn't control. Mason came back with mud on his boots and a paper evidence bag in his fist. He barely had to speak. The look on his face said snare before the word ever left his mouth. Not long after, a woman in a dark field jacket walked in with quiet authority, badge clipped at her waist. Agent Brooke Castillo. Her voice was calm, but it had edges, like someone used to telling people hard truths. "We've had complaints in that area," Brooke said, eyes scanning the bobcat crate, the worming carrier, the charted vitals on the wall. "Illegal trapping, possible transport. That torn tag you found, Cloud, could be a shipping marker. If this kitten is what it looks like, we may be dealing with more than a backyard problem." Marcy Klein arrived 10 minutes later, heels clicking like a metronome of pressure. "We need to stay professional," she said, glancing at Brooke's badge. "No drama, no rumors. The public loves a miracle story until it turns into a liability story. Our donors don't fund chaos." Grant Holloway stepped between them like a wall. "The Bobcat goes back out," he said, voice flat. "Soon. The longer he stays, the higher the risk. We run a rehabilitation center, not a sanctuary." Elaine felt the words hit like cold water. She looked at the kitten, so small in the carrier, white fur bright against the gray world, short legs curled tight. The kitten's breathing still rasped at the edges, but when the Bobcat made that low, hoarse call, the kitten's eyelids fluttered as if the sound itself steadied it. Grant pointed to the schedule taped near the door. "We transfer the kitten to a neonatal foster today. Lydia Shaw is on her way. And we prep the Bobcat for released evaluation." Lydia arrived carrying a soft tote that smelled faintly of clean cotton and warm milk replacer. She was kind-eyed, careful, a woman who'd spent years doing late-night emergency vet hand feedings and knew what it cost. Time, money, the kind of medical bills people didn't plan for. She spoke gently to Elaine, then to the kitten, as if the kitten could understand the promise in her voice. Elaine let herself breathe for half a second. This was the Hayit plan on paper. Then Tara lifted the carrier to move the kitten to Lydia's hands. The change was immediate, like a wire pulled tight. The Bobcat surged forward in his crate, slamming the metal with a hollow clang that rattled the floor. His ears flattened. His mouth opened in a raw, broken sound that didn't match the animal's size, less a threat than a desperate call. The kitten answered with a sharp, thin cry, suddenly louder, suddenly panicked. On the monitor, the oxygen number dipped. The kitten's breaths turned wet again, scraping at the throat. "Bring her back," Elaine said, her voice low but urgent. Grant's face hardened. "Elaine, just 2 feet closer," she insisted. Tara shifted the carrier nearer the crate. The Bobcat's body trembled, then settled by inches. The kitten's crying softened into a shaky whimper as if it had found the edge of safety again. No one spoke for a moment. Even Marcy's phone stayed silent in her hand. Elaine moved in to recheck the Bobcat's leg, and that's when she saw it. Subtle, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. Along the Bobcat's underside, near the abdomen, the fur was slightly damp, the skin tender. Not an open wound. Something else. A sign that made Elaine's stomach twist, not from fear, but from grief she couldn't yet name. She swallowed hard, feeling the room's fluorescent light turn harsh on her eyes. "Grant," she said quietly, "we need to run a hormone panel." Grant stared at her. "Why?" Elaine glanced at the Bobcat, then at the kitten, and felt her throat tighten as the pieces began to line up in her mind. "Because I think," she said almost to herself, "this isn't just protection." The lab ran quiet in the late afternoon, the kind of hush that makes every small sound feel larger. A centrifuge whirred behind a closed door. Somewhere down the hall, a cage latch clicked, then the soft shuffle of paws on bedding. Outside the windows, the rain had thinned to a cold mist, turning the pines into blurred charcoal shapes. Elaine stood with Tara at the counter, studying the hormone panel as if the numbers might rearrange themselves into something easier to bear. A paper cup of coffee sat untouched near her elbow, gone dark and bitter. In Bay 2, the Bobcat lay pressed to the front of his crate, eyes half-lidded but fixed on the warming carrier, like a vow. Each time the kitten's breathing hit a rough patch, the Bobcat released that low, hoarse call, raw as sandpaper, steady as a heartbeat. Grant Holloway entered without knocking, his expression already set for a fight. Marcy lingered behind him, phone in hand, the faint scent of perfume, at odds with antiseptic and wet fur. Elaine didn't soften the truth. "He's in a false pregnancy state," she said, tapping the page. "Elevated prolactin, hormones consistent with maternal drive." She hesitated, then added the part that made her throat tighten. "And there's mild lactation." The room didn't move for a second. Grant's eyes narrowed. "That's rare." "Rare doesn't mean impossible," Tara said quietly. She looked pale under the fluorescent lights, her hands still smelling faintly of latex and warm fleece. "It explains the behavior, the calling, the refusal to eat, the way he steadies when she's close." Marcy's voice was careful, like she was stepping around a crack in ice. "If anyone hears that," she said, "it turns into headlines, lawsuits, the kind of donor backlash that affects everything from emergency vet care to our liability insurance. People don't understand nuance." Elaine almost laughed, but it came out as a tired exhale. "I'm not thinking about headlines," she said. "I'm thinking about two lives that crash the moment we separate them." Agent Brooke Castillo returned as the sun dipped behind the mist, bringing the outside world into the room with her. She carried a folder, damp along the edges, and the smell of wet asphalt clung to her jacket. "We ran the partial marker," Brooke said. "Cloud is consistent with an internal label used in a few recent animal trafficking cases. Mostly small exotics, designer breeds." Her gaze landed on the kitten, white as fresh paper, short-legged, trembling even in warmth. "That kitten didn't wander in from the woods." Mason's jaw tightened. "So she was dumped." "Or dropped," Brooke said. "People run when they think they're being watched. They toss what slows them down." Elaine felt heat behind her eyes. She looked at the bobcat's leg again, the deep groove where wire had bitten into flesh. Mason's photos showed more than a single snare. Drag marks, tire tracks, a story written in mud and blood. Tara pulled up imaging on the screen, old trauma around the bobcat's chest and abdomen, healing in the stubborn way a wild animal heals when it has no choice. Elaine remembered the way the bobcat held the kitten, not tight like a trap, but careful, as if he'd already learned what it meant to lose something small. Grant stared at the screen, and when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before. "If he had kittens," he said, "and he lost them." Elaine nodded once. The words sat heavy in her mouth. "Then that crying in the brush didn't just catch his attention," she said. "It hit the one place in him that was still open." From Bay 2, the bobcat called again, softer now, almost broken. The kitten answered with a tiny sound that wasn't quite a cry, more like a sigh. Brooke closed her folder. "We can't treat this like a simple wildlife removal call," she said. "This is evidence, and if we move him too soon, we may lose the thread." Grant's gaze flicked from the papers to the crate, to the kitten's monitor, the green numbers glowing like a fragile promise. His mouth opened, then closed again. For the first time, he looked less like a judge and more like a man cornered by mercy. "Tomorrow," he said at last, voice tight, "we decide what kind of place this center really is." The next morning arrived bright and cruel, the kind of winter sun that makes wet pavement sparkle like broken glass. Inside Redwood Ridge, the light from the skylights fell in clean rectangles across the floor, and every footstep sounded sharper than it should have. Elaine could taste stale coffee and mint gum, a nervous habit, while she watched the bobcat through the crate bars. He hadn't slept much. Neither had she. His eyes were still fixed on the warming carrier, as if looking away might let the kitten slip from the world. Grant Holloway called them into the conference room, a plain space that smelled faintly of paper, toner, and the lemon cleaner someone used too generously. A binder sat in front of him, permits, protocols, state guidelines. The kind of documents that decide what a licensed life looks like. Marcy Klein was already there, posture perfect, phone face down like a warning. Agent Brooke Castillo leaned against the wall with her folder, calm as stone. Mason and Tara stood close to Elaine, as if warmth could be shared by proximity. "We have to be realistic," Grant began, voice controlled. "This center exists to rehabilitate and release, not to create dependent animals." Elaine kept her hands flat on the table so no one would see them tremble. "And we have to be honest," she said. "When we separate them, the kitten's oxygen drops, the Bobcat spirals. This isn't a feel-good story we're chasing, it's measurable." Marcy lifted her chin. "Measurable doesn't protect us from consequences," she said. "One complaint, one bad headline, and donors vanish. People threaten lawsuits over less. We've spent years building trust, support that pays for emergency vet care, medications, and the liability insurance that keeps our doors open." Brooke's voice cut in, low and steady. "This isn't just optics. The snare, the tire tracks, the label, there's a criminal chain here. If that kitten came from trafficking, then she's evidence. And if that Bobcat was trapped on purpose, we're looking at felony animal cruelty." She glanced at Grant. Moving him back into that area could jeopardize an active investigation. Grant's eyes narrowed. "And keeping him here violates the very purpose of this place." Tara spoke softly, the way people do when they're afraid their truth will be drowned out. "There's a legal sanctuary option," she said. "Cedar Hollow. Enclosures that mimic forest. Minimal human contact. State approved." The word sanctuary hung in the air like smoke. Marcy's expression hardened. "A sanctuary placement looks like failure," she said. "It tells the public we couldn't do our job. Funding is not unlimited. People who write big checks want outcomes that fit on a brochure." Elaine felt heat rise behind her eyes, not from anger alone, but from the exhaustion of watching a life get weighed like a budget line. "Our job," she said, "is to do what keeps them alive without creating a bigger danger." Grant leaned back, jaw tight. The room went quiet except for the distant beep of a monitor down the hall, slow and stubborn. Elaine pictured the kitten's white fur under the warming light, the faint wheeze that still scraped at her breathing. She pictured the Bobcat's wire scar, raised, angry, permanent. Then Brooke's phone buzzed. She read the screen once, and the muscles in her face shifted. "We picked someone up," Brooke said. "A man with snares in his truck and a small trailer. He's not talking much, but he's scared." Mason's voice was rough. "Did he say anything about the kitten?" Brooke hesitated, and for the first time, her calm cracked just enough to show the weight underneath. "He said one thing," she replied. "He swears the white, short-legged kitten wasn't his. He said it fell out of a box when a shipment got dropped." Elaine felt the room tilt. A box. A shipment. Her mind flashed to the torn plastic strip, cloud, mud-smeared and wrong in the woods. Grant stared at the table as if the paper in front of him could answer what mercy demanded. Outside, the sun kept shining, bright and indifferent. Inside, the decision drew closer, sharp as a blade. 2 days later, the papers were signed with hands that didn't feel steady. Grant Holloway stood at the admin counter with a pen poised over Cedar Hollow's transfer agreement, the kind of document that turned a hard decision into something legal. Outside the office window, sunlight lay across the parking lot in a clean, buttery stripe, and for a moment, the world looked almost gentle. "Sanctuary placement," Grant said quietly, not as an announcement but as surrender to what the facts demanded. "Temporary with review." He looked at Elaine. "You were right about the risk. We can't release him into an area with active trapping and an investigation." Marcy Klein didn't smile, but she didn't fight either. She only exhaled, slow, like someone letting go of a story she'd tried to control. "Keep this handled," she murmured. "No sensationalism. If we tell it with dignity." Brooke Castillo nodded once, and with evidence. The transfer van smelled of warm rubber mats and clean straw. Mason drove while Tara sat in the back, watching the bobcat's crate. The animal, still wild, still wary, had stopped slamming the bars once the kitten's carrier was strapped close enough for him to hear her. The kitten's cries were softer now, more like tiny complaints than panic. Every so often, she gave a weak mew, and the bobcat answered with that husky sound that had become, somehow, a promise. They reached Cedar Hollow Wildlife Sanctuary by late afternoon. The place felt different the moment Elaine stepped out. Pine air with a hint of sun-warmed sap, the distant rush of water somewhere beyond the trees, and a wide quiet that didn't press in like the walls of a clinic. The main enclosure stretched out behind double gates, fallen logs, boulders, brush piles, and a slope that rose into shade. It looked, to the eye, like a patch of true forest that had simply agreed to be fenced. Lydia Shaw arrived an hour later with the kitten, her car packed with soft blankets, formula, and a small portable oxygen unit. Practical things that cost money and patience, the kind of ongoing care most people don't think about until they're facing medical bills and hard choices. Lydia lifted the carrier gently, as if it were made of glass. The kitten's white fur caught the late sun and glowed faintly, almost silver at the edges. Elaine's throat tightened as the gates clicked behind them. They kept it controlled, no direct contact at first, just sight and sound through a protected mesh panel. The bobcat was released from his crate into the enclosure's holding area. He stepped out like smoke, low, cautious, muscles shifting beneath damp fur. His wire-scarred leg took weight carefully, and for a second he looked like he might bolt into the brush and vanish. Then the kitten mewed. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was unmistakable. The bobcat stopped. His ears turned, his head lifted, and his eyes found the small carrier in Lydia's hands, as if the world narrowed to that single point. He walked forward. Elaine felt her own breath catch, the way it had in the backyard on that first night. The bobcat approached the mesh, slow and deliberate, and pressed his nose close enough that his whiskers brushed the metal. The kitten's eyes blinked open, cloudy but present. She let out a trembling cry that sounded like relief. And then the bobcat did it again, the thing no one could explain away as coincidence. He lifted one foreleg and laid it gently along the mesh, as if reaching, not swiping, not striking, just placing his paw where the kitten's warmth would be if the barrier weren't there. His body curved toward her, making that familiar cradle shape. Lydia's face crumpled before she could stop it. Tara wiped at her eyes with the back of her glove. Even Mason, who had handled animals in panic and pain for years, stared down at his boots like he didn't trust his own expression. Elaine turned and saw Grant Holloway standing behind them. The man who'd spoken in protocols and hard lines had his lips pressed tight, his gaze fixed on the bobcat's paw, and tears made small bright tracks down his cheeks. He didn't wipe them. He simply watched, as if he'd been waiting his whole career to see proof that wild didn't mean without love. Brooke stepped aside to take a call. When she returned, her voice was low. "The suspect broke," she said. "That box wasn't groceries. It was animals." The kitten's survival, your records, your photos, the timing, gave us what we needed to connect the chain. Elaine looked back at the enclosure. The bobcat stayed there, quiet and steady, guarding with nothing but presence. The kitten's crying eased into soft, tired breaths. Grant swallowed hard and finally spoke, words rough with emotion. "We thought we rescued her," he said, but it looks like he rescued both of them. The sun slid lower, turning the fence line gold. The air smelled of pine and clean earth, and for the first time since that midnight call, Elaine felt the tight knot in her chest loosen. Sometimes she realized the most powerful medicine isn't in a syringe or a vial. Sometimes it's simply being held. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Before you scroll away, tell me this. Do you believe a bond like theirs could really exist? If this story touched your heart, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might just remind you that sometimes the wild loves us back in ways we'll never forget.